In this video, we're breaking down every single Battlefield game and ranking them into a tier list that takes everything into account: campaign, multiplayer, graphics, and overall fun level. We have to start at the very beginning with Battlefield 1942. Released all the way back in 2002, this was one of the very first large-scale multiplayer FPS games ever, and it set the tone for everything that would come afterwards. This was World War II on a scale most players had never experienced before, and it opened up the floodgates for more than 20 years of combined arms chaos: infantry, tanks, planes, and ships, all clashing together on a massive map. At launch, the game came with 16 multiplayer maps and supported up to 64 players in a single server. For the early 2000s, when most of us were still trying to survive on spotty internet connections, this was insane. And if your internet couldn't keep up, well, no problem, you could load up with bots offline and still get some of the Battlefield experience. Over its lifespan, another 20 maps were added through DLCs and patches, and there was even a basic single-player mode built around major World War II battles like Operation Market Garden and Iwo Jima. Of course, most players were here for the multiplayer, which introduced Battlefield's first ever class system, with Scout, Assault, Anti-Tank, Medic, and Engineer. Each one filled a specific role, giving players their first taste of that signature Battlefield teamwork and personal expression that's been a staple of the franchise ever since. 1942 also had two expansions, The Road to Rome and Secret Weapons of World War II, which both added some more content and kept Battlefield players hooked. Compared to modern Battlefield titles, 1942 was primitive and missing a lot of the polish and features you'd expect today, but without this game, the franchise just wouldn't exist. It was the spark that lit the fire, and for that reason alone, it's legendary. Still, if we're ranking it by today's standards against all of the amazing Battlefield games of the past 20 years, we're going to put this one in the B tier. After the breakout success of 1942, DICE followed it up with Battlefield Vietnam in 2004, and this one leaned even harder into multiplayer. The campaign was barely there, just a handful of missions, but the real focus was on online battles. Most of the maps were based on actual conflicts from war, like the Battle of Hue, Operation Flaming Dart, and the Fall of Saigon. This gave players a chance to fight through some of the most famous moments of the Vietnam War. Battlefield Vietnam also introduced a ton of new toys to the sandbox. For the first time, players had access to jets and helicopters, which instantly changed how the battles were played out. And of course, the arsenal brought in some of the most iconic weapons of the era: the AK-47, the M16, the M79 grenade launcher, and the M40 sniper rifle. This game also added a brand new innovation for the series at the time: customizable classes. Instead of being locked into just one loadout, you could pick one of the four main classes and then swap certain weapons around for alternatives, letting you tailor your kit to your playstyle. Just like with Battlefield 1942, you could still jump into matches with bots if your internet wasn't up to par. The problem was the bots were hilariously bad. Even by early 2000s standards, they were infamously bad. Sometimes they'd just bail out of helicopters at random, sending the chopper spiraling into the ground. And if you weren't paying attention, you might get crushed by one falling out of the sky. It made for some unintentionally funny but pretty frustrating moments. The game launched with 18 maps, including 5 that were used in a new mode called Evolution. This was the very first time Battlefield experimented with a back-to-back map sequence where you'd play one battle and then roll right into the next one on a connected map. This wouldn't return again until 12 years later in Battlefield 1's Operations mode, but it really all started here. Unlike 1942, Vietnam didn't receive any DLC expansions. Instead, DICE added a World War II mod later on, which reused some of the original Battlefield 1942 content along with a few new maps and weapons. It definitely wasn't groundbreaking, but it gave players a little bit extra to chew on and acted as some nice post-launch support to make the fans happy. All in all, Battlefield Vietnam expanded on the formula that 1942 created and gave fans another fun way to dive into the chaos of large-scale warfare. It wasn't the most polished entry, and some fans even viewed it as more of a jungle reskinned version of 1942. The bot AI is still legendary for all of the wrong reasons, and it ultimately didn't leave a huge mark on the franchise, but it did set the stage for bigger things to come, so we're going to put this one in the C tier. Released in 2005, Battlefield 2 was the first modern-era Battlefield game, moving away from the World War settings of the first two entries. Instead of storming World War II beaches or jungles, you were dropped into a fictional 2007 conflict where the US, Europe, and the UK clashed against Russia, China, and the Middle Eastern Coalition. This was a pretty bold step, and it ended up shaping what Battlefield would look like for years to come. One of the biggest innovations Battlefield 2 brought was the commander role. For the first time, one player per team could take a bird's eye view of the map, calling in artillery strikes, dropping supplies, and coordinating with squad leaders. Then the squad leaders could pass down the orders to their squad mates, turning the chaos into something that actually resembled organized warfare. When it worked, it was amazing. The commander role almost felt like playing StarCraft in the Battlefield universe but with real players. And when it didn't work, well, you probably just ignored your commander and squad leader and did your own thing instead. This game also introduced the defibrillator for the medic class, and that single addition completely changed the flow of squad combat. Suddenly, medics could instantly bring teammates back into the fight, and a good squad with players filling up every role became an unstoppable force. That revive mechanic went on to become one of the most defining features of the Battlefield franchise, and it all started here. Battlefield 2 also gave us the most classes the series has ever seen, 7 in total: Assault, Medic, Anti-Tank, Engineer, Support, Special Forces, and Sniper. Later games would eventually condense these roles a bit, but here you really felt the specialization in every class. Pair that with vehicles that were dominating the field, with helicopters, tanks, APCs, and even strong stationary gun emplacements, and you had a sandbox where map knowledge and teamwork made or broke every single round. A skilled attack chopper duo could absolutely control the skies, while tank crews on the ground made life miserable for anyone caught out in the open. The game featured some of the best multiplayer maps of the franchise, including maybe my personal favorite, Strike at Karkand. In fact, many BF2 maps came back as remakes in future Battlefield titles. On top of the base game, BF2 also had 3 major expansions: Special Forces, Euro Forces, and Armored Fury. Of course, like any PC game of the 2000s, Battlefield 2 had its share of hilarious glitches and some absolutely brutal patch sizes. It wasn't uncommon to lose an entire day just trying to download and update the game, even with some solid internet speeds. While the ranking system added some long-term progression, it was hilariously slow compared to modern Battlefield titles. Hitting max rank was a grind that only the most dedicated players were ever going to accomplish. I think DICE basically didn't expect anyone to hit General ever. Overall, Battlefield 2 was a massive leap forward for the franchise. It introduced so many systems that are still part of Battlefield today. It wasn't perfect, but it set the standard for what this series could become and was absolutely packed with innovation. For that reason, we're placing Battlefield 2 firmly in the S tier. Battlefield 2 Modern Combat holds a special place in the franchise, not because it was one of the best Battlefield games, but because it was the very first one to make the jump over to console. Released in late 2005 for the PS2 and original Xbox, and then a few months later in 2006 for the brand new Xbox 360, it landed right in that awkward spot between console generations. And the difference in hardware really showed. On PS2 and Xbox, Modern Combat looked and played pretty rough. The graphics were muddy, the performance was shaky, and it just didn't hold up well compared to what PC players were used to. But if you played on Xbox 360, well, that version was a big step closer to the high-end PC experience that Battlefield 2 was delivering, and it finally gave console players a taste of what the franchise could really offer. The single-player campaign also tried something new for the series. Instead of being locked into one character, Modern Combat let you hot swap between different soldiers during missions. It was almost like a prototype version of what Grand Theft Auto 5 would do many years later. It was a neat idea on paper, and it did give the campaign a different feel compared to past Battlefield titles, but it wasn't enough to make the game stand out in any major way. At the end of the day, Battlefield 2 Modern Combat is remembered more for being the series' first step onto consoles than for the gameplay itself. It wasn't terrible, but compared to the main other Battlefield entries, it just didn't have the same staying power. For that reason, we're going to place Modern Combat in the C tier. Released in 2006, Battlefield 2142 was DICE's first big swing at a futuristic Battlefield, and it also ended up being the last PC exclusive title in the franchise. Instead of World War II or modern conflicts, this one dropped players into a sci-fi war for survival, complete with hovercrafts, drones, and even massive Titan airships dominating the skies. 2142 launched with 10 maps and added a few more later through expansions. It also streamlined the class system with a big change down to just 4 options: Assault, Engineer, Recon, and Support. This might sound like a step back compared to the 7 classes we had in Battlefield 2, but the customization and unlock system here made each role feel deeper. Classes had their own primary weapons, but what really set them apart were the gadgets like recon drones, squad beacons, and anti-vehicle landmines. Squad leaders even had unique tools like deployable drones that could spot or fire on enemies, plus buffs that let their squads respawn faster. For maybe the first time, having a good squad leader actually mattered, and it encouraged players to stick together instead of just running off as lone wolves. Each class had about 3 main weapon options, which gave players flexibility without overwhelming them too much. Recon could run with a sniper or carbine, Assault had rifles and some fun alternative loadouts like underbarrel shotguns, Support got LMGs and then later a shotgun, and engineers had anti-tank rifles and rockets. This setup became the backbone for Battlefield class design moving forward. Of course, the big spectacle of 2142 was the vehicles. DICE introduced a ton of futuristic tech: mech-style walkers, hover tanks, APCs, gunships, and the Titans themselves. The Titan mode quickly became a fan favorite. It started like Conquest, where you fought over missile silos, but once those silos dropped the shields on the enemy Titan, the battle really shifted. Suddenly, the players were boarding this massive airship, fighting room to room to blow up the consoles and eventually destroy the core. It was chaotic, cinematic, and felt way ahead of its time. Overall, Battlefield 2142 was a dramatic departure from the rest of the franchise, but it pulled it off pretty well. The futuristic setting, the class unlocks, and the Titan mode gave it its own identity, and it's remembered pretty fondly even today. So we're going to place Battlefield 2142 in the A tier. When Battlefield Bad Company dropped in 2008, it marked a huge shift for the franchise. Up until this point, Battlefield games always put you in the boots of a nameless soldier fighting on the massive battlefields. But Bad Company changed all of that. It was the first story-driven Battlefield, and instead of blending you into the army, you actually got to know the characters you were fighting alongside. You played as Preston Marlowe, a fresh transfer to the B Company of the 222nd Army Battalion, better known as Bad Company. From there, you were joined by Samuel Redford, Terrence Sweetwater, and George Gordon Haggard Jr., a ragtag squad of misfits who turned what could have been just another grim war story into something much more lighthearted, fun, and full of personality.
Sweetwater, just shut up.
What? I didn't say anything. But you just did. That's not fair. I know you are, but what am I?
Shut up.
The banter between these guys is still some of the best character work that DICE has ever done, and it gave the campaign a completely different flavor. Bad Company was also the very first game to use the Frostbite engine. That's right, the same tech that would go on to define Battlefield for years to come started right here. This early version of Frostbite introduced destructible environments, letting players blow holes through buildings, level cover, and reshape the battlefield in real time. It was groundbreaking back then, and it still influences how developers think about destructible environments in shooters today. The multiplayer side of Bad Company wasn't as big or polished as some of the other mainline titles, but paired with the brand new tech and a unique comedic campaign, it made a lasting impression. This was the moment that Battlefield proved it could be more than just large-scale warfare. It could also tell a memorable story. For its leap forward in technology, its unforgettable cast of characters and a fantastic campaign, and its somewhat mediocre multiplayer experience, Battlefield Bad Company earns a spot in the B tier. Battlefield Heroes was one of the strangest detours the franchise has ever taken. Released in 2009, it was the first free-to-play Battlefield, and instead of gritty, large-scale warfare, it felt more like a Saturday morning kids cartoon. It featured bright colors, goofy characters, and over-the-top animations. It was basically Battlefield reimagined as a lighthearted third-person shooter. The art style was closer to something you'd expect from early Fortnite than the darker tone of Bad Company, and just like Fortnite, the cosmetics were a big part of this game. Although in typical EA fashion for that era, it slid pretty hard into pay-to-win territory. On the plus side, Heroes ran on really lightweight PC requirements, meaning just about anyone could play it. But in the end, the monetization got the better of it, and the game was shut down in 2015, along with a fan revival project later on. It was a fun, simple experiment, and maybe a little bit ahead of its time, but the heavy emphasis on pay-to-win monetization left a bad taste, so we're going to place Battlefield Heroes in the C tier. Battlefield 1943 was a console-only throwback to the original Battlefield 1942, and it stripped down things to the very basics. There was no campaign, no story mode. This was pure multiplayer chaos. There was just a handful of maps, a few vehicles, and some classic weapons, but it delivered exactly what it set out to do: some fast, chaotic Battlefield action. In a lot of ways, it felt more like a tech demo, laying the groundwork for bigger games like Bad Company 2. But even as a smaller title, it pushed the destructibility forwards. Entire buildings could now be leveled, and terrain deformation brought a new scale of destruction to the series. The class system in this one was really simple: Rifleman, Scout, and Infantry, with 4 faction-specific vehicles rounding out the sandbox. Pair that with some surprisingly good music choices, and 1943 carved out its own little spot in Battlefield history. It didn't have nearly the depth of the bigger Battlefield titles, but for what it was, a streamlined, console-focused Battlefield experience, it worked pretty well. And impressively, some people still hop on to play it even today, so Battlefield 1943 lands in the C tier. Battlefield Bad Company 2 is often remembered as one of the very best entries in the entire franchise, and for good reason. Released in 2010, it brought back the Bad Company squad for another round of single-player action, but this time with a darker, more serious tone. While the humor and banter of the original was still there, the stakes felt higher and the campaign itself was far more ambitious. You once again took control of Preston Marlowe alongside Redford, Sweetwater, and Haggard, but this time the missions had a much wider scope. One moment you'd be fighting through intense close-quarter battles, the next you'd be rolling around in tanks, piloting UAVs, or manning a mounted gun in an on-rails firefight. It was cinematic, had a ton of variety, and gave you way more reasons than ever to care about the squad you were fighting alongside. But as with most Battlefield games, the campaign was really just the appetizer. The multiplayer is where Bad Company 2 cemented its legacy. Built on the Frostbite 1.5 engine, it looked absolutely stunning for the time and pushed destruction to a whole new level. Entire buildings could be destroyed, the cover was never permanent, and every single fight felt different depending on how players reshaped the battlefield. This wasn't just eye candy, it fundamentally changed the way that matches were played out. The class system here became the backbone of modern Battlefield: Assault, Engineer, Medic, and Recon. 4 simple roles, each with clear strengths, weaknesses, and a loadout that made teamwork essential. The game modes were also expanded. We still had the classics like Conquest, but Bad Company 2 introduced Squad-based Rush and Squad Deathmatch, which were more focused on intensity and tighter squad-centric design. The audio in Bad Company 2 deserves a specific shout-out. Every explosion, every sniper shot echoing in the mountains, it was just goosebump-inducing. DICE's sound design basically won awards. And of course we can't forget the Vietnam expansion. This was a full-on reimagining of the earlier Battlefield Vietnam, but built on Bad Company 2's engine. It brought new weapons, vehicles, and a handful of beautifully designed maps that perfectly captured the chaos of jungle warfare. This wasn't just a reskin, it felt like a whole new flavor of Battlefield, and many players still rank it among the best DLCs that DICE has ever made. All of this came together to create a game that struck the perfect balance between cinematic single-player storytelling and an absolutely legendary multiplayer. To this day, many Battlefield fans still point to Bad Company 2 as their favorite of all time, and it's not hard to see why. For its unforgettable destruction, fantastic class balance, and the kind of gameplay that kept players hooked for years, Battlefield Bad Company 2 earns a well-deserved spot in the S tier. Maybe DICE will finally give us a Bad Company 3 someday. Battlefield Online was one of the most obscure entries in the series. It was a free-to-play remake of Battlefield 2 developed by NeoWiz Games for the East Asian market, and let's be honest, it really wasn't great. The visuals were worse than the original, the player base was tiny, and supposedly DICE had very little involvement in this project. That probably explains why the graphics looked especially bad compared to Bad Company 2, which was releasing around the same time. Running on the old Refactor 2 engine, Battlefield Online suffered from clunky performance, technical issues, and a really short lifespan. It lasted only 3 years before EA finally pulled the plug in 2013. Honestly, that was probably for the best. Battlefield Online was a forgettable experiment, and we're putting it down in the D tier. Battlefield Play for Free wasn't much better. Built on that same outdated Refactor 2 engine, it dropped players into a modern setting similar to Battlefield 2, with US versus Russia, but with only an online multiplayer mode. The game featured 8 maps and 3 modes, but the outdated visuals and clunky performance really held it back out of the gate. Picture Battlefield 2's graphics and gameplay, but then imagine them 6 years out of date and running in a clunky browser-based launcher. That was the experience. What really killed it though was the monetization. Progression for free players was painfully slow, while weapon upgrades and items cost absurd amounts of real money. It was called Play for Free, but if you wanted the full experience, it felt more like pay to win. It was EA's attempt to wring in a few extra bucks out of old Battlefield content, and it really showed. Unless you had a rich uncle sending you some money for battle funds, you were stuck with a pea shooter and a dream. Between the pay-to-win system, technical problems, and unimpressive graphics, Play for Free, or as some remember it, Battlefield Pay for Power, quickly became known as one of the weakest entries in the franchise. And just like Battlefield Online, we're ranking this one down in the D tier. Battlefield 3 was the much-needed reset button for the franchise, and it absolutely delivered. Released in 2011, this was the first game built on the Frostbite 2 engine, and it completely redefined what players thought was possible in a shooter. I still remember the first gameplay trailer. It didn't look like a video game, it looked more like a high-budget Hollywood action movie. The lighting, the animations, the destruction, it was just jaw-dropping. And honestly, those trailers are still worth watching today. They're some of the best marketing that DICE has ever pulled off, and they set the tone for a game that felt larger than life. The single-player campaign was visually stunning, but the story itself was a little bit underwhelming. It leaned heavily into the gritty modern military tone, which was a bit generic, but the real standout was the addition of the separate co-op mode. It wasn't a huge part of the experience, but it gave players a reason to team up outside of the main campaign. Of course, the real magic of Battlefield 3 was its multiplayer. To this day, a lot of veterans argue that it was the best Battlefield multiplayer experience ever made, and honestly, I would have a hard time disagreeing. It struck the perfect balance of big vehicle battles, intense infantry fights, and the cinematic only in Battlefield moments. Ask anyone who played Rush on Dam of Van Peek and they'll tell you about the moment, the base jump. An entire team of attackers leaping off a massive cliff to assault the next objective in unison. It's one of those iconic FPS memories that players still talk about a decade later. The game shipped with 9 maps, but across its 5 expansions, that number grew to 29, and each DLC had its own theme. Close Quarters focused on tight infantry combat, Armored Kill doubled down on massive vehicle warfare, and Back to Karkin brought back some of the most beloved maps and weapons from Battlefield 2. And of course there was Operation Metro, one of the most popular maps in Battlefield history. It became the blueprint for that close quarter meat grinder style of gameplay that we'd later see in Operation Locker 24/7 servers during Battlefield 4. Classes were streamlined into the now familiar 4: Assault, Engineer, Support, and Recon. This combined with the massive arsenal of weapons, gadgets, and vehicles, the multiplayer felt endlessly replayable. Whether you were flying jets, holding choke points, or running around with a squad capturing objectives, Battlefield 3 showcased some of the best that the franchise ever had to offer. When people talk about the golden age of Battlefield, this game almost always comes up. It had the spectacle, the balance, the unforgettable moments, and the community to back it up. Battlefield 3 wasn't just another step forward in the franchise, it was a huge leap. And for that reason, it belongs right up at the top. Battlefield 3 is without a doubt an S-tier Battlefield game. When Battlefield 4 launched in October of 2013, it represented another massive leap for the series. It was the first Battlefield to run on the Frostbite 3 engine, and it also served as the franchise's debut on the brand new PlayStation 4 and Xbox One consoles. Expectations were sky high, and visually the game didn't disappoint. This was one of the best looking shooters of its generation. But as fans remember all too well, the launch itself was rough, really rough. Battlefield 4 was plagued with crashes, connection errors, bugs, and some of the worst netcode we had ever seen. Getting killed around corners became a running joke because it happened so often in those first few months. Honestly, the launch was a frustrating mess. Fortunately, DICE stuck with it, and over time, Battlefield 4 completely turned things around. With steady patches and community input, the game went from being one of the most broken Battlefield launches to becoming one of the most beloved entries in the series. Even today, many players call it the best Battlefield game ever made. That recovery story is a big part of what makes BF4 so special. On the campaign side, Battlefield 4 improved on Battlefield 3's single-player mode with a more cinematic presentation, stunning visuals, and missions that gave players a variety of experiences. From infantry shootouts to vehicle-focused segments, it still wasn't the main attraction, but it showed that DICE could still deliver a polished single-player experience alongside their trademark multiplayer. And multiplayer, of course, was the real heart of the game. Battlefield 4 carried over the 4-class setup: Assault, Engineer, Support, and Recon, but massively expanded what players could do with them. The arsenal was staggering. Over 80 weapons, each with attachments and accessories to fine-tune your playstyle, plus more than 50 vehicles, many of which were customizable in their own way. It opened up the floodgates for player creativity, and it's where the only in Battlefield motto really started to take off. Whether it was C4ing a tank to jump on top of a roof, or taking down a jet with a tank shell, Battlefield 4 became the home of those insane community-shared moments. The map pool was equally impressive. The base game launched with 10 maps, and expansions added many more, each bringing something unique. Siege of Shanghai in particular gave us the most famous example of evolution, which was Battlefield 4's big innovation with destruction. Watching an entire skyscraper collapse in the middle of the map wasn't just some cool set piece, it completely reshaped the map and the flow of the battle. Other maps featured dams that were breaking, ships crashing ashore, or weather systems that massively shifted the fight mid-match. Destruction had always been a Battlefield staple, but BF4 pushed the new Levolution system into blockbuster territory. One moment you're fighting in beautiful sunny weather, then the next a tropical storm rolls in and capsizes an entire destroyer onto your island. It was dynamic and cinematic. Other notable features helped round out the experience. The Commander mode made a return from Battlefield 2, giving one player per team an overhead view to resupply squads and call in support. The new field upgrade system gave squads perks for staying alive together, rewarding teamwork but also punishing full wipes. Then there was also the test range where players could practice with their weapons and vehicles, something the community had been asking for years and I was personally super happy about. and DICE even launched a community test environment where players could preview changes and provide feedback before updates went live. It was one of the earliest examples of a big developer working directly with its community, and it played a major role in the game's turnaround. And of course, we can't forget about the secrets. Battlefield 4 was legendary for its Easter eggs, with the Phantom program being maybe the most famous. Unlocking the Phantom Bow was an entire community-driven quest that was filled with hidden codes, assignments, and even physical dog tags hidden in real-world locations. It was one of the coolest secrets in any shooter, and it added another layer of depth for dedicated players. Looking back, Battlefield 4 had a disastrous launch, but an incredible redemption arc. Between the massive sandbox, the best destruction the series had ever seen up to this point, and a community that kept the game alive for years with players still logging into the service today, it's no surprise that it's still regarded as a fan favorite. Battlefield 4 isn't just a great Battlefield game, it's one of the greatest multiplayer shooters of all time, and a true redemption story after a terrible launch. And for that reason, it comfortably sits up in the S tier. Battlefield Hardline took the series on a huge twist. Instead of the usual military versus military setup, Hardline swapped soldiers out for cops and criminals in a cops versus robbers style spin on Battlefield. The campaign leaned heavily into this theme, playing out like a TV police drama. It was an interesting idea, but let's be real, most Battlefield fans weren't exactly clamoring for a CSI style story. Still, it had some fun moments even if it never reached the heights of the bigger Battlefield games. Multiplayer was where things really got more interesting. Hardline introduced several new modes like Heist, Blood Money, and Hotwire, which were all tailored for that cops and robbers theme. The class system mirrored Battlefield 4 in structure, but it did get rebranded. Operators filled the assault role, mechanics took over as engineers with some recon style gadgets, enforcers brought the heavy support weapons, and professionals filled the sniper role with traps and surveillance gear. The biggest departure though was in vehicles. Gone were the jets and tanks and heavy armor that usually defined Battlefield. Instead, Hardline focused on cars, but these weren't just for driving. You could stash RPGs in the trunk, turning them into mobile weapons platforms, and making car chases genuinely chaotic. On top of that, the game included a hacker mode, which is basically the commander mode reimagined with tools like GPS jammers and Trojan horses to fit the more modern crime vibe. Hardline definitely wasn't the most polished Battlefield game, and it didn't have the staying power of many of the other more popular titles, but it was original and it was often hilarious with friends, and it gave the franchise something completely different. I'm probably going to get some hate for this in the comments, and you can go ahead and roast me for it, but despite the poor reviews saying it's the worst Battlefield game of all time, I personally had a lot of fun playing this one with friends, and I'm going to save it from the bottom of the barrel and put Hardline in the C tier. When Battlefield 1 released in 2016, it took the franchise to the earliest setting we've ever seen, back to the days of World War I. At the time, almost no major shooters were exploring this era, so the decision felt really bold, fresh, and risky. And as soon as those trailers dropped, everyone was sold. To this day, Battlefield 1's reveal trailer is still regarded as one of the best game trailers of all time. The atmosphere, the music, the tone, it was perfect marketing, and it set the stage for one of the most unique Battlefield experiences ever made. Battlefield 1 leaned hard into the brutal, chaotic nature of the Great War. You had access to the earliest versions of tanks, biplanes, triplanes, armored trains, and even massive airships that were dominating the skies. For the first time, you could fight on horseback as armored cavalry, lance in hand, charging headfirst into machine gun fire. Trench warfare brought in some of the grittiest weapons in Battlefield history: gas grenades, flamethrowers, and a huge variety of melee weapons from clubs to shovels to bayonets. The single-player experience was also a departure from past games. Instead of one continuous campaign, Battlefield 1 introduced war stories. These were short, character-driven missions told from different perspectives across the war. From the Italian Alps to the Sinai Desert to the Argonne Forest, you saw the war through the eyes of the individual soldiers, and it gave the campaign a more personal, grounded feel that really resonated with a lot of players. The multiplayer though was where Battlefield 1 really made its mark. The class system returned with Assault, Medic, Support, and Scout, which were familiar names but tailored to the era. Assault carried SMGs and explosives for trench fighting, Medics had rifles and healing gear, Support wielded SMGs and resupplies, and Scouts acted as snipers and spotters. Unlike Battlefield 4, you didn't have the universal weapon categories like carbines or DMRs to mix across the classes, and here your role was more tied to your class identity, which made squads feel a little bit more distinct. Battlefield 1 also introduced elite classes. These were power kits that you could pick up on the map that totally changed how you played. You could become a flame trooper wielding a gas mask and a massive flamethrower, or a tank hunter carrying the monstrous 1918 Tankewehr rifle, or a sentry armed with a huge machine gun. These classes were really tough to bring down and often required some really good teamwork, or just one brave bayonet charge if you timed it just right. On top of that, matches featured behemoth vehicles. These were giant blimps, armored trains, and battleships that would spawn in for the losing team as a comeback mechanic. They weren't always perfectly balanced, but they did add a huge sense of spectacle and cinematic scale that made every round feel memorable. Operations mode in BF1 stitched maps together into grand campaigns, and wow, it was really epic to fight across these multiple fronts in one enormous battle. Of course, Battlefield 1 wasn't without criticism. Customization was far more limited than in Battlefield 4. Most of the guns just had preset variants rather than fully customizable attachments, and for me that was something that made sense but felt really lacking compared to the other more modern Battlefield games. The controversial sweet spot mechanic for snipers also really divided the community, letting them score one-shot body kills from certain ranges. I guess it was some attempt to discourage backline camping from snipers and make bolt actions more viable, but certainly not everyone loved it. Still, visually, Battlefield 1 was breathtaking. The Frostbite engine delivered some of the most stunning atmospheric maps that the series has ever seen. The muddy trenches, ruined cities, dynamic weather, and the war-torn fields made every battle feel so cinematic. This, combined with the unique Arsenal and World War I settings, made Battlefield 1 really stand out as something truly different in the franchise. It might not sit at the absolute top of the series for a few reasons, but it was still a brilliant game that left a really strong impression and is fondly remembered by many fans. So I think Battlefield 1 earns a place up in the A tier. Battlefield 5 took the series back to World War II, but this time around, things didn't land quite as smoothly as DICE might have hoped. Released in 2018, it built heavily on the foundation of Battlefield 1, which led to a lot of criticism from fans who felt it was a little bit rushed out and maybe too similar in tone and gameplay. A lot of players, myself included, were ready for a return to modern combat, so revisiting World War II again felt kind of like a letdown right out of the gate. The single-player campaign once again used the War Stories format from Battlefield 1, this time highlighting some of the lesser-known battles of World War II. While they were visually stunning, the formula was starting to feel a little bit too familiar. Battlefield 5 also introduced a co-op mode called Combined Arms, where squads could tackle missions like assassinations, capturing objectives, and other PvE-style challenges. This was similar to what Battlefield 3 experimented with a few years earlier. The real changes came in multiplayer. Battlefield 5 introduced combat roles, which were essentially skill trees layered on top of the four classes: Assault, Medic, Support, and Recon. This gave players more specialization within each class, and while it was an interesting idea, the community was pretty split on how much it actually improved the formula. The Operations mode from Battlefield 1 was also expanded into Grand Operations, which stretched the matches across 4 fictional days of combat, which added a sense of progression to the mode. There were some new mechanics as well. For the first time, players could build fortifications and embankments onto the battlefield to control areas and strengthen defenses. It was a cool twist in theory, but in practice it never really fully caught on with most of the player base. Vehicles returned in the usual World War II fashion with tanks, planes, and transports, but with limited ammo that had to be resupplied at stations, it added another layer of management to vehicle play, which was met with some criticism. Weapons were era-specific, featuring classics like the M1 Garand, the MP40, the BAR, and the K98, and cosmetics made their way into the franchise in a big way too. You could customize your weapon appearances and also tweak some functional details like the scope magnification. On paper that sounds great, but some of the cosmetic choices drew some backlash for not really fitting the World War II theme, which was another reason the game had a little bit of a rocky reception. Instead of selling a premium pass or traditional expansions, Battlefield 5 launched Tides of War, which is a live service model where new content and storylines were added over time at no extra cost. This helped extend the game's lifespan, but it also meant that the early months felt a little bit thin compared to the 2 previous titles that just launched with big DLC roadmaps. The Pacific update gave us some classic maps like Iwo Jima and Wake Island in stunning detail, but it was perhaps a little bit too late to fully redeem the game. And that kind of sums up Battlefield 5 as a whole. It's a beautiful game with a strong foundation, but at launch it felt like it was really missing some of that all-out war identity that defined a lot of the best entries in the series. Over time, the patches and updates improved the experience quite a bit, but the initial stumble lost so many players it kept it from ever reaching the full heights of Battlefield 1, 3, or 4. Many who stuck it out will tell you that the gunplay and movement were among the best in the series. And on the positive side, the BF5 ragdoll physics were notoriously goofy. Overall, Battlefield 5 wasn't a bad game, but it's also not remembered as a great one. Many players said that it felt more like playing Battlefield 1.5. I think it sits somewhere in the middle ground. It's mostly a solid game, especially after all the updates, but it's still kind of lacking the magic of the best BF games, and for that reason, we're going to place it in the B tier. Battlefield 2042's launch wasn't just bad, it was historically bad. Steam reviews hit overwhelmingly negative, and the player count took a nosedive within weeks. Critics and fans slammed it. Reviews called it the lowest rated installment in the series, with complaints about missing staple features, buggy netcode, and rough performance. But it wasn't just the buggy launch that defined its reputation, it also seemed to struggle with its identity back at the drawing table. Reports and insider leaks suggested that BF 2042 may have started life as something totally different, a battle royale or a hero shooter hybrid. One of the well-known industry leakers, Tom Henderson, tweeted that the early plans pointed towards a BR design heavily influenced by titles like Apex Legends, even though that version was eventually dropped. One way or another, this game felt much different than what Battlefield fans had come to expect. The game launched without the most basic features that you'd expect from almost any modern FPS game, like a scoreboard that would show your kills and deaths. It featured a paltry 22 weapons at launch, which was laughable compared to many of the previous titles. And the gunplay felt absolutely awful at the start of the game. Bullet spread, or bloom as many call it, was off the charts, leading to many players using only the PP-29 since it was effectively the only usable automatic weapon at range. And the bugs were unreal. It was common to watch hovercrafts driving straight up the side of a skyscraper. If the game stopped right here, it might have been the worst rated Battlefield game of all time. Luckily though, DICE's turnaround was dramatic. Update 4.0 in April of 2022 packed over 400 fixes, everything from bug sweeps to gameplay rebalancing. Subsequent seasons introduced familiar features like the class system of the older Battlefield titles and some beloved legacy weapons. The game slowly but steadily reshaped into something us fans would recognize. And fast forward to mid-2025, DICE dropped what's likely to be the game's final update, the Road to BF6 event. It brought back the iconic Iwo Jima map, complete with a towering volcano, trenches, bunkers, and tactical landing zones. It also added new weapons, vehicles, and a free 60-tier battle pass that unlocked Battlefield 6 cosmetics, a pretty big win-win. One of the biggest selling points for Battlefield 2042 at launch was the scale and spectacle of the maps, not just in size, but how they would actually change during a match. DICE heavily leaned into the idea of these dynamic weather events, with giant tornadoes tearing across the battlefield and sandstorms that would engulf entire maps. When they worked, they were jaw-dropping. Seeing a tornado rip through a map, pulling up vehicles and debris while players grappled and wingsuited around it was one of those only in Battlefield moments. These events didn't happen every match, which made them feel more special, but they were designed to keep the chaos unpredictable and cinematic across a wide variety of terrains. They didn't always live up to the hype mechanically, sometimes they were a little bit more of a nuisance than a tactical tool, but visually they really helped to set 2042 apart. Another major innovation was the plus system for weapon customization. In past Battlefield games, if you wanted to change an attachment, you'd have to go back into the menus or swap your loadouts between spawns, but with the plus system, you could swap attachments in real time during a match. Your optics, barrels, ammo types, grips, all of that was adjustable on the fly. This gave players far more flexibility in adapting to the moment-to-moment chaos of a Battlefield match. On a personal note, as a longtime sniper enjoyer, the plus system made switching engagement ranges with a sniper to be one of my favorite parts of the game. You could seamlessly swap from close quarters sniping to engaging targets hundreds of meters away without ever needing to redeploy for a new scope magnification. One area where Battlefield 2042 actually tried something pretty bold, and maybe doesn't get enough credit, was with its gadget system. Even with all the controversy around specialists, some of the gear that they brought to the table gave us brand new toys to play with. The Oscar drone could spot enemies, paint targets for lock-on, and even disable vehicles with the EMP blast. The wingsuit on Sundance gave you unmatched mobility, letting you soar across skyscrapers on maps like Kaleidoscope, or pull off some crazy escapes and flanks that just weren't possible in other Battlefield games. And let's not forget the guided missile launcher, better known as the Lissile. This thing literally lets you steer a rocket mid-flight, weaving it through cover to hit vehicles that thought they were safe. If there's one area where 2042 stayed true to its roots, it's with the vehicles. Say what you want about specialists or the launch bugs, but the sheer variety of vehicles was a big win for the sandbox. You had access to just about every kind of modern military hardware you could imagine. Many fans really appreciated how each category of vehicle felt really distinct and had its own counters. Hovercrafts could brute force their way across terrain and even climb up some places they had no business being. Helicopters and jets offered unmatched speed and firepower but demanded some skill to master, and tanks always gave that feeling of raw, unstoppable power. A solid squad running around in a Wildcat, Brawler, or Mav could dominate a map until a railgun tank was there to shut you down. I especially like how there's something important to do for basically every seat in one of these vehicles. It keeps you engaged as a passenger instead of just using them as a ride from point A to B. Another thing that made 2042 stand out was its scale. For the first time in the franchise, DICE introduced 128 player servers on PC and next-gen consoles. The idea of battles that large sounded incredible on paper, with entire maps erupting into chaos with tanks and choppers and squads colliding all at once. But in practice, it was kinda hit and miss depending on the map design. When it worked though, it was the closest that Battlefield has ever come to simulating a full-scale war. The game also launched with 2 new modes alongside all-out warfare. Hazard Zone was a high-stakes extraction-style mode where squads would compete for objectives against both players and AI. It had some potential, but it never really gained traction and was quietly shelved a little bit later on. On the other hand, Battlefield Portal was one of the most ambitious and creative features that DICE has ever shipped. It let players create custom modes by creating content from past games like Battlefield 1942, Bad Company 2, and Battlefield 3, mixing eras, weapons, and rule sets in ways that the community had never seen before. This produced some really fun and nostalgic experiences, and it also opened up the door for Portal to be used in future BF games for even more potential. In short, Battlefield 2042 started as a really rough and incomplete experience. It was missing key modes, stability, and the polish that every modern FPS needs. But through some developer persistence and community-driven updates, it eventually shaped into something much closer to its potential. I've personally noticed a big divide in player sentiment between friends who love vehicle gameplay and those who prefer the more boots-on-the-ground style combat. My vehicle-loving friends seem to absolutely love this game for reasons similar to 2142, but those who wanted something more similar to BF3, 4, or Bad Company 2 have still been a bit disappointed despite the many improvements over the last few years. So with that said, we're going to rank Battlefield 2042 in the B tier. Not for failing to improve, but because compared to the Legends, it never quite matched the series' best, even though it came a lot closer than it ever looked like it was going to at launch. Battlefield 6 is set to launch in October of 2025, and after an excellent beta, I'm genuinely excited. From what I've seen, it feels like the remix of Battlefield 3 and 4 that fans, myself included, have been waiting for ever since BF1. That said, if there's one thing the last 20 years of this franchise have taught us, it's that you can't judge a Battlefield game by its beta, or certainly not in the first few months. These games often take time to settle, to be tuned, and to ultimately become what they're meant to be. My hope is that this time we're a lot closer to that polished, finished product at launch, instead of waiting years to reach it, but I guess we'll see. Be sure to subscribe for more Battlefield content and let me know where you would rank these games differently on your own list.